Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Rajan Raval, IBPSA Education Committee Chair. Welcome everyone on this webinar called Performer, Consumer, or Expert, a critical review of building performance simulation training paradigm for building design decision making. I'm very glad that Sara and Clarice has accepted our invitation to offer this webinar, which is based on one of the article on a special issue of Journal of Building Performance Simulation. Clarice is one of the co-editor of this particular special issue, and she will be joining. She has joined the webinar along with the Sara. She's also co-author of the paper which she and Sara has wrote. As you know, that this webinar series is based on JBEP's special issue, and we'll be offering about 7 or 8 webinar based on articles of the special issue. Without taking much time, I will hand it over to Sara and Clarice. Before I hand it over, if you have any question, to use a question pane, which is on your GoToWebinar panel. And after the delivery of presentation, I will be moderating question and answers. Thanks for joining. Over to Sara.
Okay, thank you, Rajan, for the introduction. I'm Sara Alsaadani. I'm an assistant professor of architecture at the Arab Academy for Science, Technology and Maritime Transport in Cairo, Egypt. And as Rajan said, I'm here today with Clarice to talk about our review article. It's entitled Performer, Consumer or Expert, a critical review of building performance simulation training paradigms for building design decision making.
Hello, I'm Clarice Bleil de Souza, Associate Professor at the Welsh School of Architecture, Cardiff University in the UK. And I'm going to be starting with a presentation. Next slide, please. Coming a little bit from a market perspective, highlighting the urgent demand that is imposed on architects nowadays to independently understand and quantify design decisions for sustainability and energy efficiency. So as we all know, the legislation and the guidelines are going from prescription to performance, and that means we have to actually calculate how our buildings behave instead of just following a set of parameters, and that is imposing a completely different load and set of skills onto professionals who need to be able to do so. Next slide. So from a market perspective, we also have findings of a recent international survey indicating that almost 50% of the architects think that building performance should be a core component of architectural education, and also that the simulation should become a demonstrable skill prior to licensing within professional architecture bodies. So that means training is needed. Next slide. From an educational perspective, that has been a debate for quite some time going on, and Beausoleil Morrison's highlight together with Hofer very well in their paper on 2015, that the teaching of simulation is a topic that deserves as much attention as the development and validation of models and simulation tools. And we all heard the sentence garbage in, garbage out, and it's exactly on that kind of mindset that the whole thing should be looked at the moment. Next slide. So we do highlight there is a gap in the knowledge, so no solid and comprehensive theoretical foundation on how to teach simulation to architects and designers. And we are going to try and explain a little bit more of that. Next slide. Basically, when we look at the literature, we see a collection of case studies documenting individualized teaching approaches, but no real overarching review that says, well, this seems to be the approaches commonly undertaken to teach simulation. We do see a lot of variation country by country, school by school, and even within the same author trying different initiatives, but no real overarching attempt to understand how this different teaching is, different kinds of teaching are undertaken. So there is no one size fits all on this teaching, we know that, but then actually how can we organize the discussion to move forward? Next slide. So we do go back to what Joe Clark highlights in his 2015 paper, A Vision for Building Performance Simulation, that he prepared on behalf of IBPSA board, and it's published in the Journal of Building Performance Simulation, claiming that there is an urgent need to harmonize this disparate educational information being used within degree programs worldwide. But before trying to harmonize anything, we propose that we need to actually understand how simulation is taught for building design purposes in the wider milieu to enable this harmonization to happen. Because if we don't even know how it's currently done, it's pretty difficult to actually try and find solutions or different or more homogeneous or even harmonic way of doing it. Next slide.
To achieve this understanding, we conducted this study with the aim of basically finding or extrapolating the teaching paradigms that are commonly used to teach BPS in the building design context. We limited our scope to formal training initiatives, so formal teaching occurring at universities around the world, both at the undergraduate and postgraduate level. But as these were formal training initiatives, we didn't include student self-learning, whether using help files or online tutorials or wizards within our review. We also focused on studies describing the use of BPS for optimizing architectural and building design decisions. So we didn't include works discussing training for the use of HVAC systems and controls. And finally, we only looked at English language publications just for the purposes of legibility and just practicality. The methodology we used in this study was a systematic literature review, basically searching for the literature describing how BPS is taught to support design decision-making. Various scholarly and academic sources were consulted, both related to energy and the built environment and building design education. The sources we searched in are included in the table, in the article in this table on the side. Please take a look at it. And we also used various keywords to refine our approach, both related to building simulation and architectural education and architectural design studio as well. And through this search, we were able to find 37 papers that were relevant and suitable for our analysis. The analysis we performed was basically a thematic content analysis using a manual open coding technique. Guided and underlined by this search for paradigms of thinking in BPS teaching. And this search and analysis allowed us to basically extract 3 paradigms related to 2 approaches. One that we call a domain-specific approach, which is basically concerned with the inward view of simulations, the inward view of the community, and basically software development. From this, we have a single paradigm that we called training the simulation expert. On the other side, we have what we describe as a user-centric approach. And what we basically mean by that is the outward view. Those users who might not really need to understand all the details and the intricacies of the development of the software, but really do need to use it to influence and possibly guide their design decision making. Departing from the user-centric approach, we have 2 paradigms, both of them related to the teaching of architecture students. One is called architecture students as the consumer of simulations, and the other is architecture students as the performer of simulations.
So within the training the simulation expert, we have about 5 iconic publications which basically which come from this domain-specific approach and try to consolidate the idea of the expert. Next slide. So at the very core of this, I think the slide didn't go through. Next slide, please. At the very core of this, we have the idea of teaching the next generation of simulationists. So that is the main focus of training the expert. And it's mainly towards consolidating simulation as an area of expertise within building physics and engineering. And it's like quite a broad training. It's not only about developing or training software pilots, it's about actually providing critical mass and people with all the abilities to do simulations, to criticize results, to fit into teams and so on. It's learning simulation as an experimental procedure to be used for multiple purposes. So it's basically to produce an expert who is an independent consultant that can fit into any kind of group, any kind of team, and then contribute with the expertise of knowing physics and being able to model and being able to look at results and so on. Next slide. The training methods we found in this approach are basically start with lectures in which we have the fundamentals of physics taught there, followed by a set of structured exercises with progressive complexity. So you have exercise into one topic and then you go to the different topics, going deeper into different aspects of the physics. Then we have a self-taught software interaction. So basically either after that or alongside with doing the structured exercises, the students are supposed to be learning the software or different types of software through user manuals, and then applying and trying a little bit of what's been done or what's been instructed as exercises. Then workshops with experts to discuss results, to check for error diagnosis, to basically bulletproof the simulations and try to calibrate from calibration up to interpretation, different things. And then finally finishing the teaching of it with real exercises supervised by a trained expert, in which you have an actual more complex problem that then requires full understanding of the physics and also of the modeling techniques, then to be transformed into a proper virtual experiment. A lot of the emphasis on the training is on pencil and paper, to plan the process properly, to justify every stage, to understand the simplifications that need to happen, also to understand what kind, well, all the different aspects of performance behind it. And then a lot of emphasis on critical scrutiny of the results. So really being completely aware of what's going on and understanding every single bit of the process and the results. Next slide. We can still see that this paradigm is still in use 20 years down the line, and we highlight its importance in terms of producing this expert and consolidating the field. We do have a set of other 3 different types of examples that we think fit there. For instance, the one provided by Bernier et al., which is about formal lectures with guided exercises, a bit more of a formal teaching. Some more recent experiments, such as Beausoleil-Morrison's and Hopfe from 2016, in which they try to adapt the David Kolb's experiential learning theory to teach simulation, and then go through this kind of a cyclical process for every single concept, in which you have concept, explanation and exploration, experimenting with the concept, critiquing results and reflecting on the whole process to then proceed to the next stage. And then an example from Augenbro and colleagues, in which the students of simulation are also pushed to produce tools so they fully understand and master the fundamentals and the physics behind it. With the note that the tool that is produced in this case is focused on algorithms, not really on the interface with the user, but on the algorithms that so they clearly understand and have full control of the physics behind it. Next slide. So basically, to conclude, in relation to teaching the expert, we could see that despite having a very well-prepared professional in terms of understanding the process, the fundamentals, and also having a critical view on results and everything that's involved in it, we do see a very little focus on training for communicating and transferring information to architects, and also very little focus on providing information that fits the design workflow. So there is this understanding that this expert could, in principle, fit into any kind of team and then be able to adapt to what happens. And the question is that possible? Next slide.
Okay, moving on to the user-centric approach. As I said earlier, both the paradigms extrapolated from this user-centric approach are concerned with teaching the architecture student. And it's interesting that there are two ways of teaching the architecture student, because in some way this appears to mirror a dichotomy that can also be interpreted in a lot of the BPS literature about this issue of integrating building simulation within architectural design decision making. On the one hand, we have members of the community believing that the architect should be the performer of building simulations, and this is because by placing the power of the tools in the architect's hands, it is believed that this would streamline the design process and the design decision making. It's also believed that training the architect to be a performer of simulation is partially the evolutionary role of architectural education. And so emerging from this belief, we have what we describe as the performer paradigm, in which architectural designers, or in an educational context, architecture students, should run BPS to streamline design decision making. On the other hand, we have the counter argument, which is that BPS should be left to simulation experts to conduct the simulations and then work with the architects on results interpretation. This tends to originate from the notion that in reality, in the building industry, architects seldom perform simulations themselves and usually need to collaborate with specialists to overcome various limitations associated with knowledge and time. And so emerging from that, we have the consumer paradigm, which says basically that BPS is for simulation experts who collaborate with architects or architecture students in this context. Now, in terms of the literature, we were able to find 11 articles discussing 5 training initiatives about how to train the architecture student to become a BPS consumer. And some of the general characteristics of this are concerned with, well, basically the emphasis is on exploring interactions between designers and BPS consultants. And in this context, BPS tools are regarded as great learning tools, potential allies to the teacher and the learner to achieve better buildings and greater sustainability. The focus in these studies is on the interaction and communication mainly between the architect and the expert, and also teaching the architecture student how to work with the results of BPS. And to enable this paradigm, the BPS expert is often a core component of the teaching setup and tends to assist the architecture design student in understanding and achieving various training targets, including optimizing building envelope design, simulating thermal and acoustical behavior, improving thermal comfort, and reducing energy use intensity. Now, we were able to find a couple of different workflows in the literature describing the consumer paradigm, one which we name as an independent workflow because the architect and the BPS expert operate independently, and this can be interpreted or found in Delbin et al. 2006 and Reinhardt et al. 2014. in which the architects basically produce the design, produce the input data, migrate that data to the expert who then does the modeling and runs the simulations, returns the result back to the architects to interrogate and revise the design accordingly, and then that is migrated to the BPS expert who does the modeling and simulation once again. And this portion of the loop might occur a few times until an optimized solution is achieved. We don't call this a collaboration in this context because each professional works independently and the tasks are split between the two, with data migrating back and forth. So it's not essentially a collaboration, as the BPS professional isn't really a core component of the decision making or doesn't participate in the decision making. On the other hand, we were able to find in the literature what we do describe as a collaborative workflow in the examples proposed by Charles and Thomas in 2009 and 2010. In this setup, every 2 architecture students were put together in a team with an engineering student who in this case was the BPS expert. And the architects would devise their initial design, produce the input data that was then given to the BPS expert to do the modeling and the simulations. And then together, the 2 sets of professionals would interrogate the results, explore these results, and modify the design accordingly. The emphasis in this set of articles is basically on the collaborative workflow rather than the quality of the modeling, because it is acknowledged that in an educational scenario and in a limited time frame, it can be difficult for students to achieve higher quality modeling.
When we looked at the paradigm of the performer, which is, as Sara explained, is different from the consumer, we found around 15 publications related to it. Next slide. So basically on the performance paradigm, the emphasis is to make the architects understand performance and impacts of design decisions on performance. So it's a far more hands-on approach, and it's centered in empowering the designers to use the tools to guide the design process. And that is well aligned with the idea of learning by doing, which is not only learning by doing in using the tools, but also learning by doing in the design process. So the 2 sort of go together. And that comes from the constructivist ideas, potentially from Piaget's theories, in which the learning comes from one's personal experience. It's all about the active manipulation and involvement with the tools, and this idea of interacting and having experience in using the tools, so you can get the best in terms of knowledge, and you also can get the best in terms of creative problem solving. Next slide. So we did find that this was by far the most common paradigm of teaching, because we found about 15 papers related to that. However, it is quite time intensive, so most of the work reported 1 semester long course related to that, in which you have incremental construction of knowledge and also sets of design and tests approach. So we basically have a set of traditional lectures in building physics and simulation, and then you have to train the students into using the software, normally more than 1, because we are talking about different performance domains. So it was not unusual to find the training in thermal simulation and also computer fluid dynamics or thermal simulation and lighting. So more than 1 simulation domain. The whole idea behind is to try and instrumentalize the architects so they can use the tools in a context of producing evidence-based evidence for the design process. So it's design tools in an evidence-based design process, or from aiding decision making to inspiring it. Next slide. I think you jumped the slide, Sara. Anyway,
this is the next.
No, okay.
This is the next.
Okay, so advantages of that are to visualize the impact of design decisions. So we can use the tools to clearly see if you make a design move, what happens. To support the synthesis of design ideas. So for example, to check if you do something, what is the impact into the different performance domains and how can you actually find an integrated solution for different problems. To improve or more effectively incorporate passive design strategies, which is a very important thing in the sense that if you want to have passive buildings, then you have somehow to instrumentalize architects to be able to test their proposals. Otherwise, they don't really know how they are doing with it, and we know how discussable rules of thumbs are. So to be able to go more in depth into that, and also to visualize the interactions of the different design domains together. So that's why we see examples in terms of teaching thermal performance and daylighting together with CFD and so on. So if you make a design change, what's the impact of that change into the different performance domains? So we see clearly that training performers implies training more people in broader and more targets and than the ones in relation to the consumer. So that also explains potentially the length and the more detailed approaches. We have different approaches in this situation, and we won't go into detail into each of them because you can have a look at the paper later on. Next slide. So basically, the design, the whole idea behind that is to have the tools and to expand the role of design and think about problem solving using simulation, so that there is this evolutionary role of architects' education, as Sara mentioned in the very beginning. And that would enable the designers themselves to query their projects and to set up what are the targets that they want to test and what kind of performance domains they want to explore. And we found a very interesting proposition in Kim and colleagues, in which design is seen as a process of discovery, and then why not add performance to it and the simulation tools to this discovery. So that makes the whole design exploration more profound. So simulation in this context is seen as a very welcome addition to this iterative and cyclical design development process. Next slide.
Okay, now that we have basically identified and discussed each of the three paradigms separately, now we look at each two of the paradigms in conjunction. And we attempt to discuss how each professional trained under each of these paradigms would be situated in post-educational, so practical project scenarios in the building industry. And the first juxtaposition that we have is the expert and the consumer. And we basically see that these two professionals are two sides of the same coin. They enable each other, if you will. So that's because in a practical project scenario, the expert provides consulting to the and the consumer, the architect, uses this information provided by the expert to guide, to navigate the design process, to influence design decisions. So that's all well and good, but then the question that surfaces here is, are these two sets of professionals trained to work together in an effective manner? Well, what do we know from the literature? We know that most of the literature on the consumer front focuses predominantly on gaining interpersonal skills for collaboration and communication, which has been, or which was the focus of the articles as we could find. On the other hand, we don't know, or it's not clear from the literature alone, if the consumer architect has enough technical knowledge needed to communicate with the expert. There doesn't appear to be much in the literature that shows agreement in terms of what elements of knowledge need to be conveyed to the consumer to allow him or her to communicate and collaborate with the expert. On the other hand, when it comes to training the simulation expert, clearly this set of professionals has been trained to focus on detailed technical knowledge. But on the other hand, we don't know, or it's not clear from the literature, whether the expert has enough knowledge on how architects make design decisions, what the design process looks like, work forward. And so we fear at this point that given these kinds of gaps in the knowledge between these two users, it might be that the full merit of this very valuable technical information that is provided by the simulation expert could be very largely unexploited in a collaborative scenario.
So when we compare the performer and the expert training, we pretty much use the analogy of the medical field, in which we have the performer as the generalist or the general practitioner, and the expert as the consultant, who would then be called in a second stage to do either diagnosis or to proceed with treatment or assessment, if you want. So the advantages of that is, in a way, can be interesting to delay consulting with experts, especially in certain types of scenarios, such as small practices or situations in which you have less stringent energy regulations, or when green building certification is still optional or not, or might be an aspiration of the client, but not to go in full for it. In these situations, the performer could save time and money and could project some practical scenarios and enable decisions to be made within the office without having to go out, speeding up the process, and at the same time not only making it more efficient, but also guiding decisions and highlighting things to be further discussed and further explored with the experts. In this context, also, we can see the performer as a good translator, so as this bridge between the expert and the architect, to make sure that the information is really being transferred and that the best out of simulations and simulation experts can come on the second stage. Next slide. Sara, are you there?
Okay, so yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. So, okay, there appears to be a bit of a lag. So to conclude this presentation, through a systematic review of the literature, we were able to identify 3 paradigms that are commonly used to teach BPS in the building design and the architectural design context. We have training the simulation expert, training the consumer architect, or training the architect to become a consumer of BPS, and training the architect to become a performer of simulations as well. Each of these paradigms implies a different teaching approach because each has a different set of aims and learning outcomes to achieve. We do hope that now that we've able to identify these 3 paradigms, we hope that this work helps to set a foundation to contribute towards this much needed harmonization of educational information, as Clarice mentioned earlier in this presentation, which was what Joe Clark said in his position paper prepared on behalf of the IBPSA board. And having identified these aims, we have several questions to leave the audience with to think about for future work. We believe that it might be a good idea for members of both the architectural and BPS communities to come together to think about and discuss these questions or these topics. When it comes to training the simulation expert, what are the elements of architectural knowledge that we would need to ensure are conveyed to the BPS expert that would help improve collaboration and communication with architects? how do we convey this knowledge effectively to the simulation expert? The challenge in this scenario is that most architectural knowledge is gained in a tacit measure through learning by doing. Conversely, when it comes to training the consumer architect, what are the elements of building physics and BPS that we would need to convey to the consumer architect to allow effective interaction with the expert? And again, how do we convey this knowledge effectively to the consumer? Again, knowing that the challenge is that most BPS knowledge is also acquired via tacit means. And finally, when it comes to training the performer, what are the elements of building physics and BPS that we must convey to the performer architect to ensure that the BPS process is accurate and quality assured in a way that can be used as a basis for design decisions? And again, how do we effectively convey this to the performer architect to ensure that the process complements and enhances the design process? That brings us to the end of our presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I hope we haven't gone over the time allotted for us, so that we have time for questions.
No, this is perfect. I think it's just about 35 minutes when we started. We started about 3-4 minutes late, but this is perfect. Thanks, Sara, and thanks, Clarice, for wonderful presentation. I invite audience to send me questions using a question pane, and if you want me to unmute after I read the question, I'll be happy to do that. Or if you want me to read your question, I will be happy to do that as well. We have one question so far, and question from Michael Whitty. Michael, can I unmute you? Yes, I can. Okay. Let me, before Michael asks a question, let me introduce Michael, because I say in terms of simulation and training, I definitely will consider Michael as one of the most experienced person in the world. He is a principal engineer at Guard Analytics, and Guard Analytics is the one who developed Energy Plus training programs years back. Probably, I think 2003, the first training module came out from Guard, and then onwards they are extremely engaged in education of simulation. Michael, over to you.
Well, my question was, do you have any data on the prevalence of this kind of training within schools of architecture, whether they're open to adding this to the curriculum, whether it's present already? Is it widespread or just a few?
Do you want to answer?
Yeah, I was just going to ask if it would be okay if I took that. Thank you for your question, Michael. At this point, it's not very clear. I think when we started off this article, the answer to your question was really the motivation for this research. And so we felt that the first thing to do was to look at the literature and understand how BPS is being taught. I believe, I think I participated in a survey a few months back, collecting some data about the teaching of simulations in different schools of architecture in different countries. I was not involved in that. I'm not sure if, I don't think Clarice was. Were you, Clarice?
No.
No, so I don't think we have the results of that survey yet, but it would be very interesting to look at some widespread data after having defined these paradigms, I think.
Yes, thanks. This presentation was excellent in defining the different paradigms, and as you suggest, it gives a great starting point for talking with others about curriculum development and how to go forward and improve that penetration. So thanks.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Before I go to the second question, Sarah, are you mentioning a survey which was taking around a few months back on IBPSA platform?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. Okay. So I was the one who was doing that, and we have received reasonable amount of information, which I will be happy to share with the group in few days. And we are hoping that we'll be able to prepare a document on this through IBPSA Education Committee. Let me go on to the second question, which is from Thiago Goes, and let me unmute him. He will be able to. Thiago, I have unmuted you. You can ask a question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the lecture. I'd like to ask you guys a question about. I read a while ago a paper from Hinhart, and he was saying that maybe a way to go for the future would be like having the expert next to the architect like the performer, but in a way that the expert would like provide the architect with some template or something like that. And the architect would perform his workflow and ask his own questions to answer better his design. Don't you think that maybe there is have a middle path between the architect as the performer and the architect as the consumer in the future, maybe?
So do you mean, because I think the example you described is pretty much the idea of the consumer and the expert. So are you suggesting that we could have the performer and the expert? Is that what you imply? I'm not sure I understood your question correctly.
Okay, yes, exactly. Not the architect with not the architect as the consumer of the simulation made by the expert, but the expert working to provide some resource, so the architect would be the performer, but he wouldn't do like all the work of the simulation, or maybe just the work of framing the simulation. He would be helped by the expert, but he still be the one that would be performing and the one that will be asking the questions himself.
That's I think is pretty much what we tried to say in one of the last slides, in which we have the performer and the expert, and we try to make an analogy with the medical field. We're not saying that necessarily the workflow would be from the generalist to the specialist. What you are suggesting is a slightly different workflow, but within that mindset of having the generalist and the specialist. Does that make sense?
Yes, pretty much.
Yeah, so it would be, we just provided one illustration of that idea of juxtaposing the performer and the expert together. But obviously there is more to be explored there, because this is part of almost it is part of our discussion in the paper. So, you know, it's the idea of juxtaposing the paradigms and then exploring them in that sense. And that's why we have the idea of the expert and the consumer initially, because that is pretty much the two sides of a coin, as we say. But then also to further explore this idea of the expert and the performer, and bringing some of the analogies with the medical field to it. But there can be others. And what you are saying is potentially more towards this bridge and this translation, isn't it? In which the expert can act, in which the performer can act as a translator to the expert and prepare problems and questions that can go into more detail. Yes, I think that's totally possible.
Okay. No, because I would like to know, I understand that's the beginning of your research in this sense, but which way would go so the architect would be more like a performer next to the expert, close to the expert, but more independent? What's the bottleneck that you see?
I think all options are on the table. The point was for us to highlight the different paradigms so you can explore these different options. And that's what the paper is about. I think it's leading for different explorations, but in an organized way. And that's basically what we say here.
Oh, well,
Yeah, I
okay.
think that makes a lot of sense. I think, and there would be more details if you really go through a paper which is in the JBEPS
Yeah.
special edition. We have one more question coming from Bandana Jha. Bandana, I'm unmuting you, and if you wish to ask question directly, you are unmuted. Bandana, you are unmuted if you wish to ask question, or shall I repeat on your behalf? Okay, let me repeat on Bandana's behalf. The question is, you have identified the problem well. In order to convert the consumer to performer, there is a need to bring changes in architecture curriculum with a deeper focus on building physics. Any study or suggestion on that?
Okay, Clarice, do you mind if I take this?
No, I will also interfere with that one because that's a hot topic. So
Yes, definitely. Okay, well, definitely, for sure, there is a need to bring in changes in the architecture on the architectural curriculum, with a focus on various issues, including building physics and building simulations and how it is taught. Again, at this point, because we were limited in our study to the literature, so we don't really have a more global understanding of how the performer is taught beyond, or how the consumer is taught beyond the literature. I think one of the critical differences, which we are exploring in further research, is the integration of the studio. So training the performer, it moves from the lecture hall, or moves from the classroom. So it moves from the theory into being integrated with design, and design process is where a lot of this learning tends to happen. And this is just an observation that I've formed from the literature, that well, some of the consumer studies and several of the performer studies look at this way of teaching BPS, or integrating BPS within the design studio to better manifest the learning of BPS in architectural education. Clarice, you had something to say?
yes, I think that is also a bit tricky because you have different ways of organizing education in different countries. So in Europe, for instance, you would have to follow the Bologna process and then somehow try to fit things into this 3 year plus 2 years. Not all countries follow this kind of, or not. You don't have students in some countries, you don't have students that follow the thing up to the very end. So it's a bit difficult to break that into different chunks. But I think what I think we need is to report on experiments and try to experiment a bit more with different ways of teaching and different ways of trying it, with some degree of measuring results, which is not just how well students understand the physics, but somehow also try to measure the impact of that into design decisions, potentially try to measure things in terms of how many and what types of queries students do into their design projects, to try and understand actually how well they understand the fundamentals and are being able to use it. I don't know a solution for that, but I think we need to experiment more, and we need some ideas as to how and when in the process we measure the results of these experiments. So we can have variation and we can actually change things perhaps quicker in terms of what doesn't work and what does work.
If I may add something to this part of the discussion, I think we are in our research on BPS and education, I think our study is basically an invitation to move beyond these individualized case studies, A lot of instructors with obviously a research interest and a belief in the importance of BPS might integrate that in their teaching in lectures or in design studio, but I think maybe it would be a good opportunity at this point to really do some comparative research on the different ways of teaching the different paradigms, just moving beyond these individualized case studies.
Okay, thank you for answering question. We don't have any further question coming from the group. I propose to end the webinar. I thank all of you who joined the webinar, and I especially thank Clarice and Sara for spending time and explaining what do they think about education and BPS. I encourage all of you to become a supporting member of IBPSA, and I also encourage all of you to register for Building Simulation 2019. Hopefully, we will have one dedicated session or a panel discussion during BS19 on education. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rajan.
Thanks, Sara. Thanks, Clarice. Bye.
Bye.